we're dedicating this.
Yeah, we're recording.
We're recording now. If you can hear, Les is recording. We don't want to, we want to put on the recording only good content.
One away from the port.
We're starting. Amba number 7. Number 7 on
49. Bamar up by 49A.
49A. We'll just what you call it. Yeah. Okay.
49.
We are cruising towards the end, gentlemen. It's less. It's more unruly than the Israeli parliament.
Natives are restless.
We are cruising towards the end of the 3rd chapter. That means not this week, but next week we actually will conclude Glassman. That's the 3rd chapter of Avodah Zarah. So because we're concluding a big piece, it's an opportunity for us to reassess. Michael and I had a long chat, and it's a really good time before we start the 4th chapter. We can re-talk about, everybody can give their feedback about what they enjoy and how they'd like to see us going forward, etc., etc. So basically, what I'd like to do, we've come a long way. We've done nearly 50 daf in order of Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah, the Masechta, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is 72 altogether. So we've achieved 50 of them, but and we will be concluding Glassman. Like I said, I'm most probably, if we don't talk too much next week, 2 sessions, and we should be. Let's just get that on silent. 2 sessions and might want to also move to a technology share to teach us where the mute button is.
What shoot is it that you? What team?
Participants. Okay, and then Brian, how's it, Brian?
There's only one.
There we go. So what we'll do is we'll re-look at a few things. We have discussed a few ideas, and but in the meantime, staying on the road that we've been, we're just going to okay, can you see, Jeff?
Yeah.
Okay, we're just going to continue with the last subject that we've been busy with, which is the concept of zeva zegoyrem, when a permitted and a prohibited cause combine together to cause something to happen. How do we rule? Do we have anybody in? Do we have anyone in insurance here? Stephen's not here tonight. So the insurance people will tell us that they're always looking for cause. What was the cause of whatever occurred? What was the cause? If God forbid a person's making a claim, they're going to want to know what was the cause of whatever occurred. If it was an accident, God forbid. If it was an accident, God forbid, they want to know what the cause was, which party caused it. There's more than one party in an accident. Is one side 100% responsible? Or sometimes they run a percentage factor. You can have a 60-40 or a 50-50 or a 80-20. And you can have a situation where we're exploring what caused something to happen. And as a result of whatever caused it, what are the repercussions and what are the responsibilities or the liabilities? Who is responsible? And in halacha, you have a similar concept called zeva zegoyrem, where there's not one, but more than one cause of an occurrence. So for instance, if something occurred completely as a result of avodah zarah, for instance, or isur or something prohibited, if something was completely caused by a forbidden scenario, then that which is produced would for sure be forbidden. But the main topic has been in the last few paragraphs, the last daf or two, what happens if there's more than one contributing factor. So just like your insurance, want to assess who's at fault. Is it the isur, the piece of food that comes from a prohibited place, that is at fault, or is it the permitted one that's at fault? Is it a combination? And if it's a combination, what is the weighting of the combination? Is it equal? Is it not equal? And that's very much what they were dealing with here when they spoke about the vegetables underneath the tree of Avodah Zarah. Is it the tree that caused them to grow? Is it the ground's nutrients, which are neutral? And that was the whole discussion that has been taking place. And then the Gemora brought an example last week of, you remember we spoke about the sourdough starter, that where sourdough starter was utilized in dough and caused the dough to rise. What happens if the amount of sourdough, we even had a resident expert baker to explain how this works.
Everybody likes it.
For sure.
Everybody loves someone.
Everybody loves the sourdough. So we said what actually caused the bread to rise. Sourdough that fell into the dough. And what happens if the amount that fell in is not on its own enough to cause the rising process, but rather it had to collaborate with another amount? What happens if one piece of that amount came from Isur, from prohibited substance, one came from Heter, from permitted substance? And what the Gemora was doing was comparing all of these different cases to each other. These cases were being compared one to the other. Agriculture, vegetables that benefited from Avodah Zarah, tree, foliage, protection from rain, shade. They were all different ingredients, but it's all the same thing. If a cow, how would you call it, did its business over a field, and as we know from the farmers, that's very healthy for the field. That is a very powerful form of compost. A very powerful form of manure is a very powerful form of compost. But what if that cow came from a trade source, an idolatrous source? So do you now rule out? You say, poor farmer, you can't use your field because that cow that you had running around there doing his business in your field, you thought it was a neutral cow. But that cow got lost from another place, and we have proof that that cow actually belonged to the Galochem, it belonged to the temple, where they serve idols, and the cow itself was a subject of Avodah Zarah. And if the cow is a subject of Avodah Zarah, so is its dung a subject of Avodah Zarah. Now it's gone and fertilized your field, but the issue is that's not the only thing that fertilized my field. The ground has its own nutrients. Okay, so we're going to move through these lines fairly swiftly, but what I've given you outside is the gist of all of these comparatives. And then the Gemora said that there was, it's very common in Gemora to compare arguments and opinions one with the other. So the Gemora said that there were different shittas, different opinions that were expressed in different places. There was Rabbanon, which is the general opinion of the rabbis. That's a generic term because the rabbis could mean the majority. All of them except for the dissenting individuals. And then there was Rabbi Eliezer who had an opinion, and Rabbi Yossi who had an opinion. And the exploration, the main focus, and like we always say, the thing is to keep an eye on the main focus. You're driving down the highway, look at the destination, at the goal. And the goal is to work out what are the views of these people on this principle called Zeba Zegoyrim. All of halacha is based on formulae and principles, and this is a particular principle where there is more than one contributing factor that causes something to be good or bad. So which insurance company are we going to nail? Which person are we going to nail?
Insurance.
Which insurance? Okay? Which person? Are we going to call it the Avodah Zarah side, or are we going to call it the other side? So, yeah. So then the Gemara said, Rabbi time de Rabbi Eliezer Dilma time de Rabbi Eliezer Mishum de Achra and Achra Aniba. Rabbi Eliezer had a principle that you've got to go with the last thing that happens. In other words, it's a matter of sequence. He places the focus on sequence. So sequence means that if you had not enough, we're going to call it yeast or sourdough to make the dough rise, but then the last little piece that fell in just tipped the scales, took us over the finishing line. And if that's the amount that took us over the finishing line and caused the dough to rise, we don't worry that it's a little bit. It doesn't matter. It did the trick. It did the trick at the end of the day. And that was his principle. Opposed to him were those who say, no, if there wasn't enough there from the source that you don't want, then it's not good enough. Igamir bi Isur Asur, Rabbi Eliezer said, if the completion is with Isur, then it is Asur. and if it completes in permissibility, mutarin, and it's permissible, vein salka, vein los salka, whether removed or whether not removed. That's exactly where we left off. That was the point at which we left off. So basically, that is another thing that we talk about. The mashal for this is, like it's always said, how will Mashiach come? I mean, it just reminds me of it. How will Mashiach come if such great generations before us didn't succeed to bring Mashiach? With people, great sages that were, and all kinds of wonderful people that might have been on a higher level than us. So our sages said, the reason we shouldn't look at it like that is because we are Kananas al-Gabe Anak. We like the dwarf that is standing on the giant's shoulders. Who sees further, the dwarf or the giants? If the dwarf is standing on the giant soldier's shoulders, then the dwarf sees further than the giant himself. The mashal is that it's not that our generation is greater than any other generation. Ours is the smallest generation, but our generation stands on the shoulders of all the generations that were before us. And therefore, spiritually, we have a distance that we can see. We have an accomplishment that we can make, l'chaim, which is more powerful than any other. So in other words, it's not who was there first, it is who finishes the job. If we are the ones that finish the job, that know how to do what has to be done, then it is our schus, it's our merit, that last mitzvah, that last thing that we do. And you can see that that's the principle. Sometimes in halacha, you can see principles in ideology too. That's very much the principle that Rabbi Eliezer is going with. He doesn't care if there was Sa'ir His that came from an unpermitted place, or a place like Truma, that wasn't permitted to everybody. And if it's not enough, as far as he's concerned, the most incy tiny amount is enough, because that's the amount that takes us over the finishing line. That's the dwarf on top of the giant. That's the part that accomplishes it. Now, the next thing that the Gemora talks about, and funny enough, the Gemora is quoting from a Mishnah that only comes up a page later, but it is quoting from the Mishnah in this discussion. We're still baking. We're in an oven right now. It's not exactly the same, but it's almost the same. We're talking about an oven, and the way it worked with ovens in those days, there was something called load shedding. They didn't have electricity. And the way that they ran the oven was either with wood. They put pieces of wood in the oven, or they put coal in the oven, which was probably, type of charcoal, or also made from wood. They would put wood in the oven, and that was the fuel to make the oven hot, and that's how they cooked. They didn't have a pay-as-you-go electric meter. They cooked primarily with wood. Wood was the main fuel. Now, what happens if the wood came from, let's see if you can guess, an idolatrous tree? Huh? An Asherah tree. What happens if the guy that had the Asherah tree chopped up some branches, and now there's wood that comes from Avodah Zarah, and we take that wood and we put it in an oven, and we light the wood, and now we're baking. So we're directly benefiting from idolatrous material, from idolatrous fuel, idolatrous wood. And there was a Mishnah which said a very interesting thing. The Mishnah says as follows, that if you use wood that is prohibited, wood that comes from a source of Avodah Zarah, of idolatry, in your oven in order to cook your bread, the most common thing to bake your bread, there are two things you have to worry about actually. One is the bread, because if you bake the bread using that fuel, the other is the oven. What about the oven? The way it worked in the old days, they would make an oven out of clay, and when the oven didn't have an ability to phone Hirsch's or Stacks, or I don't know who else, in order to order an oven. So, sorry?
When I was young, you pick up a board, I built, put it in the ground.
You remember those type of ovens?
I remember like yesterday.
Like it would.
The best bread.
And
The best in my bread.
yeah, they baked it in an oven in the ground. So they would take clay and they would make an oven. And what actually used to happen is, in the beginning, a new oven was fairly, what's the word? It was still soft. It didn't harden enough. So actually what happened is, as you baked in the oven and made fires in it, the oven itself, not just the food cooked or baked, the oven itself improved. It got harder and it got better. So basically, the more the oven was used, unlike normal, usually we say brand new is best, pre-owned is already old. In those days, the second-hand oven was the valuable one, because the more they baked in it, the more bread that was baked in it, the better the oven, because every time they made a high level fire in the beginning, it would harden the clay and the material of the oven itself, and it would improve the oven. So now you've got a double problem. If the wood that you're making the fire from is not permitted for hana, for benefit, you've not only got a bread problem, you've got a oven problem, because now not only have you benefited from the bread that you've baked, you've benefited from the hardening of the oven. And now it's two things where you're going to have hana, where you're going to have benefit from something prohibited, the food and the oven itself, unless the exception is if the oven is an old oven and it's as hard as it needs to be. Then the oven is not gaining anymore from the fires inside it. You're cooking food, that's fine. But the oven itself is not improving as a piece of equipment. Again, our accountants will say no more depreciation. It's not getting worse. It's not getting better. It's holding its own, but it's not improving either, because it's already as hard as, every material has its tolerances. Every material has its scientific Howard tolerances. And you've gotten to a stage with the oven that new fires are not going to be a problem. Hence, this Mishnah says a very interesting thing. If you use wood that comes from an asher, from an idolatrous source, the bread you can't use, the bread's prohibited because you benefited from the wood. If it's a new oven, not only the bread, but the oven's also ice. Now you've got to smash the oven because the oven benefited from this idolatrous wood. But if it's an old oven, you can chuck out the bread, but the oven you can keep. You just have to wait for it to cool down, because all that prohibited wood did is it made it heat. It made a hot situation. Once that hot situation cools down, you can go and find some kosher permitted wood and start again. You don't have to smash the oven. And here it is inside the snan we learned in the Mishnah.
Why isn't that the same thing with a new oven?
Sorry?
Why isn't it the same?
Because with a new oven, as we were saying, with a new oven, you're actually benefiting the oven with that wood. The oven's still soft. So it's not only the bread that's baking, the oven itself is baking. So in other words, your benefit, your oven that was worth less before you started baking is now worth more. It's hardening. You're manufacturing an oven with wood that's not okay, not just manufacturing bread. The snan we learned in a Mishnah, not all heimeno eitzim. If he took eitzim, if he took wood from an asher tree, asura bahano, it is prohibited to have benefit from it. Hisik boy satanur. So in other words, you can't have benefit, you can't use the bread. Hisik boy satanur, if he went and hardened the oven with it. Kadosh yutatz, if it's a new oven, it needs to be shattered or smashed, because now basically you've got an oven that's been processed with avodah zarah. Yashan, if it's an old oven, yutzan, cool it down. Wait for the electricity, or whatever we'd call it in modern times, but wait for the elements to cool, for everything that's made, and then it's fine. Pass. If you bake bread in there, asura bahana, you may not have benefit from that bread. So once again, no benefit from the bread, no benefit from a new oven. It's got to be destroyed. Yes, an old oven is fine. It just has to cool down and start again.
How did you know the wood?
Sorry?
How did you know the origin of the wood?
They found out that the issue is that after the guy used it, he found out that he wasn't supposed to. That is the problem with the origin of the wood. Or it could be an ignorant person who didn't know. And then somebody came along and said, you realize what you're using. You're using stuff that how would you call it? The temple of idolatry that belongs to them, that wood.
You should also benefit because you're destroying their wood. So it's goodbye, Shara, or goodbye, idol.
You're not destroying the wood, you're benefiting from the wood. It's like when you make a fry, are you destroying charcoal or using the charcoal to cook your food?
Yeah, but you're taking a Shara which has been destroyed, charcoal into dust. So what if you're benefiting? It's a pleasure. Thank you, buddy.
No,
You
but
gave me
it's
nice
fuel. It's fuel.
Yeah, but
You're
he's
still-
God. He's out of the picture now because it's now.
Okay, so somebody else can't, but you benefited. You benefited from it.
So what if you
That's a good
If
thing.
somebody, no, but you benefited from avodah zarah. Jews
But
not
it's
allowed
but
to.
it's not because it's avodah zarah. It's wood that you've destroyed. You know what I'm trying to say is that here's avodah zarah. Now it's destroyed. Now I burn it up. So I cook my food, but at least he's out of my picture.
But you're still benefiting. You're not
Yeah.
supposed to benefit.
What
I
about?
think we
Whether
should
it's a-
benefit.
Can't have a
whether the
laugh,
process-
Bob.
Everything's different. isn't it?
Can imagine him.
I think we should benefit from it.
Okay,
A lot of sources, any proof that these things have actually happened and stuff.
sorry.
Are there proof that this has actually happened?
So terrorists, okay, first of all, terror is not always about what actually
No, no,
happened.
it's
But
not
yes,
the
it
thing.
does. If you've got, I drove through Melrose today and I saw a sign over there, something about parking at the temple. They've got like some kind of temple there. That's,
Hindu temple.
there's a Hindu temple there.
But I mean, you used to use.
What if you live in a house next door, there's Jews there and you make a simcha and you ask if you can use their parking? That's a question.
They used
Huh?
it, I mean, in West Street, sure, they were using the grounds opposite.
But
So-
there's
so-
not
so-
a void of
so-
sorrow.
So there's a debate. It's a debate whether that's avodah zarah. There's a debate. It's a discussion of its own whether that religion and other major religions are avodah zarah. But a temple that has idols in it is for sure avodah zarah. Anyway, let's catch a few more lines.
Don't have states.
Yeah.
How long ago were these laws
Christian.
relevant? How many?
They're relevant right now. As you sit there, they're relevant. Because today they're relevant. They would extrapolate other halachas from it. Gemora, by the way, is not about, you and I can't extrapolate halacha from Gemora. We're not supposed to. But the codifiers of Shulchan Aruch, if you open up the Shulchan Aruch, this is where they get their laws from. When they tell you, for instance, what you can and can't benefit from, those laws would evolve from these laws. For instance, take something like Zevas Agorim. Yeah. Okay, let me try to think of an example. Let's say, so you went away. I'll give you an example. Let's say, just a wild one. You went away and somebody in your staff came back and said, look, we ran out of diesel for the generator, but the very kind man from the temple next door, he supplied us with diesel. You know, people donated it to their temple, and that usually is the diesel that's dedicated and used for their service of their situation. But because you were away, we were able to use that diesel to generate stuff for you in your company and whatever. So now you benefited from energy that belonged to avodah zarah. But then maybe the machine that he used the diesel in has more than one, how would you call it, contributing factor. So it's not only the diesel. So now you come to Zevas Agorim. If two things contribute to one thing happening, maybe it also has a solar backup, and it also plugs into dear old ESCOM. So you weren't relying only on the diesel. So now you're trying to calculate, were you only relying on the diesel that came from an idolatrous place? It contributed. How much did it contribute? What other energy and fuel came from another place? So yeah, there's no doubt that they would be able to extrapolate to this in other areas. You know, you might have a good friend and, you know, his religion is to avoid
Watching the Shiur on the phone.
Derivative of
Can you tap with your phone?
yes, if it was dedicated that way. No, if it was dedicated that way.
Delivered to a place where.
Okay, right. So let's say,
Okay,
right.
These are from the same source, most probably the same tanker.
But what happens?
Would have been, some would have been pumped out there and some would have been.
Okay, but let me tell you where your problem. Yeah. So let me tell you what your problem is. That's the point. It could be commercial source, but what happens if one of his congregants, this scholar, this priest, one of his congregants actually has a diesel supply, and he goes and buys it as a gift, and he says that my contribution to the temple is 20 gallons of diesel in honor of these fancy idols over here, and the church and the temple needs to be warmed so the people can be warm in winter when they bow down and pray to all these statues. So I'm hereby dedicating and consecrating this donation of, some people donate money and some people donate things. It happens in shuls also. And I'm consecrating what I donate, says this guy, to the temple and to the avodah zarah. So then it takes on that status. Now it gets brought over the wall into your place and used for you, and you find out that this is the situation. I'm just giving you an example of how it could happen. It's unlikely, because most likely he has a supplier like you.
That could be the wood they use for cremations and you run out of wood.
Well, what about building sukkah?
Anything that you get, then anything you take from a Christian organization is a problem.
Not necessarily, not
Well,
anything.
the-
No, not anything.
no.
So, okay, so
No,
first
no,
of all,
no.
first of all, about the big religions, Christianity and Islam, we said just before, there's a huge debate of whether they are to be termed Avodah Zarah or not. Without going into it, so when we're
So who must be true? Buddhism. Who
Yeah.
must be true?
those that
Hinduism.
I'm not naming them because he posts this on the internet, so I'm not gonna name a particular religion, but there are those that are obviously paganistic. They're serving statues and
The Hindu believes in the cow.
yeah, whatever it is.
That's like
Yeah. Also, by the way, a lot depends on what's called chazaka. When it comes to halacha, when it comes to Gemora, it's theoretical. When it comes to halacha, what will be examined is what is the norm. So, for instance, they will go to a town or a place, and they'll find out what is the usual behavior in a particular town. And the town, they might find out that in this particular town, there is enough of a distance between religion and commerce, and people aren't mixing up. People aren't mixing up fuel and religion. Everybody's buying their fuel from the gas station, and it's a business. He's trying to make money. But what did get mixed up a lot with religion was wine. In the old days, a lot of wine was being used for wine libations. Hence came the dinim, the rules of Yainesa, that we had to be more careful with wine and other substances, because in that day and age, there was a lot of pouring of wine that was for offerings. Not only that, the wine was originally made for that purpose. It wasn't the other way around, that they took drinking wine for idolatrous purposes. The wine was actually being made, the whole industry was that they were making wine for idolatrous purposes. Hence, the sages came along and put, how would you call it, a ban. Let's just catch a few more lines over here. What would happen if this bread that was baked with wood that came from Avodah Zarah got mixed up with other bread? So now you've got your loaves mixed up. So what happens with the mix? Kulan asuris b'hana. According to the sages, all of these breads become prohibited for hana, for benefit. Rabbi Eliezer says, and this is quite a novel idea, he says, Yoylech hana Yam HaMelech. What you do, throw the benefit into the Salt Sea, into the Yam HaMelech, and you can use the rest. What does it mean, throw the benefit into the Salt Sea, into the Dead Sea? How do you throw the benefit? You mixed up bread that was a problem because it had already included Avodah Zarah with other bread. Now we're telling you, throw the benefit into the sea. Where's the benefit? You've got this basket of breads. You know, some are a problem, some aren't a problem. So what he said is, if you know how much is the level of the hana, for instance, the fuel, the wood that was utilized to bake this was worth, let's say, 200 Rand. So take coins of that value, throw them into the Dead Sea as to throw out that particular benefit, and the rest is okay. That is Rabbi Eliezer's very strange but novel idea. The sages say, no way. Amrullah, they said to him, Ain pigeon Avodah Zarah. There is no redemption for Avodah Zarah. You can't do this. So they argued with him and they said, this doesn't work. In other words, sometimes holy things you can be paid at. That means you can redeem. But you can't redeem Avodah Zarah. You can redeem holy things. Like just for an example, if you want to know what it means to redeem holy things, the Rebbe would give out, the Lubavitcher Rebbe would give out dollars to people, and the idea was that they should give it to tzedakah. But what would the people do? They'd give another dollar to tzedakah to redeem the one that he gave them, so that they could keep the one that he gave them as a memento. Because generally the idea is that according to halacha, when a person gives you money, they don't expect you to use exactly that money. If somebody says, take this and go to the shops, they don't care if you take that note instead of that note. You can trade around whatever it is that you are getting. If it's an article, it's different. A person gives you a thing, they're quite specific. But if they give you money, what they mean is, I've put my money in. When you get there, take out an equivalent amount and buy whatever it is that needs to be bought. You can be paid, you can redeem what a person gave you. But when it comes to Avodah Zarah, the rabbis are saying here, there is no pidyon. Ain't pidyon Avodah Zarah. You can't redeem it. That bread that got mixed up with other bread that's Avodah Zarah, tickets, it's gone. And then I'm just going to read these lines fast because it does get a drop technical here. Rabbanan de pligi alei de Rabbi Eliezer manin hu. The Gemara wants to try and work out Who are the rabbis that are arguing with Rabbi Eliezer? In other words, there's various different views given by different rabbis. Some seem to be stringent, some seem to be lenient. So the Gemora is trying to weigh them up against each other. Are these the same Rabbanan, the same rabbis who were opposed to bread baked in an oven with wood from Avodah Zarah? But they seem to be strict. They seem to say that you're not even allowed to throw the coins into the salt sea. Ela Rabbanan de Sa'ir. Maybe it was the rabbi group that argued about the sourdough starter that we spoke about before. But they might say the Shomatula Rabbanan de Mekila B'Sa'ir B'Avodah Zarah Mi Mekila. The Gemara says no, there's a difference. You can't compare the cases because when we spoke about that sourdough before, it wasn't about idolatry. The sourdough starter, if you remember before, was actually truma. The question there was no story of Avodah Zarah. It was truma. It was special holy food designated for kohanim. That's truma. Truma is a holy food that has been tithed off. It's not necessarily 10%. It's an amount that has been taken off what the Israelite farms or whatever for the kohen. But once it gets its kedusha, its holiness, the rest of us cannot eat it. The rest of us cannot touch it. So that whole discussion about how much sourdough starter was there, was it enough to cause the dough to rise or not, had nothing to do with idolatry. It had to do with whether this mixture became prohibited to us regular folk to eat because we're not kohanim. And the Gemara says you can't compare the two. Avodah Zarah is always going to be a stricter area of Jewish law than other areas. So even if people are makel, in other words, that means they're lenient. If rabbis say, look, we're not worried that a little bit of trimmer went in there, it wasn't enough to make the dough rise. That concept of being lenient is not the same as being lenient about idolatry, about Avodah Zarah. Rabbi Yosef leDevrayim de Rabbanan Amalahu ledidi zeves agoyrem mutab. So why did we find Rabbi Yossi appearing to contradict his own opinion? So he was talking according to the rabbis. This principle that we spoke of earlier, that there's more than one contributing factor that causes something to happen. More than one contributing factor causes the same thing to happen is prohibited. That was the rabbi's opinion. That's the opinion of Chazal. So Rabbi Yossi was quoting them and therefore he said prohibited. So yeah, so this is let's just sort of jump to the last few lines because that's where it concludes. The Gemara says, because conclusions always are a conclusion. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel that halachically we rule like Rabbi Yossi. What does that mean? We go with Rabbi Yossi's opinion that where there is more than one contributing factor, then permitted. We don't worry about the prohibited piece when there's also a permitted piece. And the Gemara tells us a story, a case history, a case precedent. Somebody had a garden, and the garden was fertilized by zevel, by manure from Avodah Zarah. This person had a problem. Maybe, these trucks go around selling compost. Be careful of them. They can be quite aggressive, those guys. When they come around with a truck full of manure and they want to sell it to you to spread on your grass. So this person had a garden, and afterwards he found out that he had fertilized his own garden with manure that came from Avodah Zarah. So he didn't know what to do. So he went to ask the rabbi, what can I do now? Do I now have to destroy my vegetables and my flowers? I didn't know. I put manure there from Avodah Zarah. Sholach Rav Amram Kameid Rav Yosef. Rav Amram sent this for ruling to Rav Yosef. Amalei Hacha Amar Rav Yehuda Mashmuel Halacha Rabbi Yossi. So he answered him. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. What does that mean? They answered this fellow. Here comes a practical story. He said, "Oi, I ended up using manure from Avodah Zarah for my field, for my garden. Have I now stuffed up my garden?" So he said, no, you haven't. You know why? Because although the manure was from Avodah Zarah, it's not the only factor. You know what else causes grass to grow? The soil, the nutrients that were already there before you put the compost down. The rain, the leaves, everything else that was around. And Rabbi Yossi said, and this is the final conclusion of this particular piece, Rabbi Yossi said that where there is more than one contributing factor, then we say as long as some of the contributing factors are okay, then everything is okay. And that gets us to the next mission.
Sure.
Scrap.
Yeah.
What's this?